The coffee mug trembled in Sarah Chen's hands as the first gunshot echoed through the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower. While her colleagues dove under their desks in terror, Sarah's eyes weren't on the floor, they were calculating angles, measuring distances, and assessing the tactical situation with the cold precision of someone who had done this before. In a building full of corporate executives and financial analysts, nobody suspected that the quiet woman from risk assessment had once been the most decorated counter-terrorism operative in federal service. But in the next 6 hours, that secret would save 17 lives and change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Chen had perfected the art of being unremarkable. At 34, she had transformed herself into exactly what everyone expected from a senior risk assessment analyst at Whitmore Financial. Competent but not threatening, intelligent but not intimidating, professional but forgettable. Her corner cubicle on the 38th floor was a monument to bureaucratic mediocrity, filled with spreadsheets about market volatility and compliance reports that could cure insomnia. The morning of March 15th started like any other. Sarah arrived at precisely 7:45, bought her usual medium coffee with 2 sugars from the lobby café, and rode the elevator in silence while her colleagues discussed weekend plans and office gossip. She nodded politely when spoken to, smiled appropriately during small talk, and settled into her workstation with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent 6 years building an impenetrable facade. Her official job was analyzing financial risk patterns for the bank's investment portfolio, identifying potential threats to client assets through market research and statistical modeling. It was mind-numbing work that required attention to detail but little creativity, perfect for someone who needed to disappear into the background of corporate America. Sarah had deliberately chosen the most boring department in the most conventional company she could find, understanding that invisibility was her greatest protection. What her colleagues didn't know was that before joining Whitmore Financial, Sarah had spent 12 years with the FBI's hostage rescue team, specializing in high-risk tactical operations that required split-second decisions and absolute precision. She had rappelled down buildings, breached fortified compounds, and negotiated with terrorists in 7 different languages. Her personnel file, locked away in a classified vault somewhere in Quantico, contained commendations for operations that the public would never hear about and mission reports that read like action movie scripts. But that life had ended abruptly 6 years ago when Operation Nightfall went catastrophically wrong. Sarah had been leading a team to rescue kidnapped diplomats from a compound in Eastern Europe when faulty intelligence led them into an ambush. 3 of her team members died in the firefight, including her partner and closest friend, Agent Rebecca Martinez. Sarah had managed to complete the mission and extract the hostages, but the weight of those deaths had broken something inside her that no amount of counseling or commendations could repair. The official report classified Operation Nightfall as a tactical success with acceptable losses. Sarah classified it as the worst failure of her career, and the reason: she could never again be responsible for other people's lives. She had submitted her resignation 2 weeks after the funerals, declined all attempts to convince her to stay, and vanished into the anonymous comfort of corporate employment, where the only thing at stake was other people's money. Her transformation had been methodical and complete. She had changed her appearance, cutting her shoulder-length black hair into a conservative bob and trading contact lenses for wire-rimmed glasses that made her look older and more serious. She had developed a wardrobe of unremarkable business, attire in neutral colors that helped her blend into the corporate landscape. Most importantly, she had suppressed every instinct and training response that marked her as someone dangerous, forcing herself to react to situations like a civilian rather than a federal agent. The effort required to maintain this facade was exhausting but necessary. Sarah had trained herself to walk normally instead of moving with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to combat situations. She had learned to speak in the measured, cautious tones of corporate bureaucracy rather than the clipped, authoritative language of tactical operations. She had even changed her handwriting, practicing for months until her natural bold script became the careful, precise penmanship of an accountant. Her cubicle neighbors, Jennifer Walsh and David Nguyen, were pleasant enough people who knew nothing about risk beyond market fluctuations and credit ratings. Jennifer worked in client relations and spent most of her time managing the complaints of wealthy investors who were upset about quarterly returns. David handled regulatory compliance, ensuring that the bank's investment strategies met federal guidelines and industry standards. Both were competent professionals who had never faced anything more dangerous than a hostile board meeting or an aggressive audit. They treated Sarah with the polite respect accorded to someone who was good at her job, but not particularly interesting as a person. Jennifer occasionally invited her to after-work drinks, which Sarah always declined with vague excuses about other commitments. David sometimes asked for her opinion on risk assessment methodology, which Sarah provided in careful, measured responses that revealed expertise without suggesting anything unusual about her background. The corporate culture at Whitmore Financial was exactly what Sarah had hoped for: predictable, bureaucratic, and utterly disconnected from anything that might require quick thinking or decisive action. Meetings followed strict agendas. Decisions were made by committee, and problems were solved through process and procedure rather than initiative and improvisation. It was the perfect environment for someone who needed to suppress every instinct that had once made her exceptional. Sarah's daily routine was deliberately mundane. She reviewed market reports, updated risk assessment models, and prepared presentations for executives who rarely asked probing questions about her analysis. Her work was competent but not brilliant, thorough but not innovative, exactly the kind of performance that earned steady raises and positive reviews without attracting unwanted attention. During lunch breaks, she ate alone in the company cafeteria, while reading financial newspapers or technical journals. She avoided the groups of colleagues who gathered to discuss office politics or weekend activities, understanding that casual conversation could lead to personal questions that might compromise her carefully constructed identity. When pressed about her background, she had developed a series of vague but plausible responses about previous work experience in data analysis and risk management for smaller firms. The building itself was a 60-story monument to financial success, with Whitmore Financial occupying floors 35 through 45. The lower floors housed retail banking operations and customer service centers, while the upper floors contained executive offices and conference rooms where the bank's most important decisions were made. Sarah's floor specialized in analytical services filled with cubicles where analysts like herself processed information that helped the bank's investment managers make informed decisions about where to place client money. Security in the building was typical for a major financial institution: card readers at key access points, security cameras in common areas, and a team of uniformed guards who monitored the lobby and conducted regular patrols. Sarah had memorized the security protocols within her first week, noting the locations of emergency exits, the positions of surveillance equipment, and the response procedures for various types of incidents. It was automatic behavior from her. Federal training, though she told herself it was simply prudent caution in an uncertain world. The guards themselves were professional but not particularly well trained for serious threats. Most were retired police officers or security company employees who understood how to handle disruptive visitors or minor emergencies, but had no experience with terrorist attacks or hostage situations. Their primary function was deterrence and early warning rather than tactical response, which made sense for a business environment where the greatest threat was usually corporate espionage or disgruntled employees. Sarah's colleagues had no idea that she conducted informal threat assessments during every fire drill, noting response times and evacuation procedures while appearing to simply follow instructions. They didn't realize that she had identified multiple exit routes from every floor she visited, or that she could describe the building's structural layout in detail, despite never having seen the architectural plans. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her federal training had made situational awareness second nature, even when she was trying to live as a civilian. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was working in risk assessment while simultaneously representing the greatest unacknowledged risk in the building. Her presence created a security vulnerability that no corporate protocol could identify. A highly trained federal operative with classified knowledge and specialized skills who was hiding in plain sight among people who had no idea what she was capable of accomplishing. But Sarah had convinced herself that her past was truly behind her, that the skills and instincts she had spent years developing were permanently buried beneath layers of corporate conformity. She told herself that she would never again be called upon to make life or death decisions, that her new life was safe and predictable and free from the kinds of situations that had once defined her existence. The morning of March 15th had given her no reason to question those assumptions. She had reviewed overnight market reports from Asian exchanges, updated her risk models based on new economic data, and prepared a presentation about emerging market volatility for the afternoon's department meeting. Her biggest concern was whether the presentation would run over the scheduled time slot, potentially delaying other agenda items and annoying her supervisor. Jennifer Walsh had stopped by her cubicle around 10:30 to discuss a client complaint about investment performance, and they had spent 15 minutes reviewing portfolio data to identify potential adjustments that might address the investor's concerns. David Nguyen had sent her an email about new regulatory requirements that might affect their risk assessment procedures, and she had responded with a detailed analysis of the potential compliance implications. It was the kind of morning that reinforced Sarah's belief that she had successfully escaped her former life, that the woman who had once led tactical teams into hostile territory was truly gone, replaced by someone whose greatest challenge was explaining market volatility to anxious investors. She had no way of knowing that within hours, everything she had built would collapse, and the skills she had tried so hard to suppress would become the only thing standing between her colleagues and death. The first sign of trouble came at 11:47, when the building's public address system crackled to life with an announcement that would change everything. But before that moment, Sarah Chen was just another risk assessment analyst in a building full of financial professionals, invisible and unremarkable, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen. At least that's what everyone believed. The building's morning rhythm was as predictable as Sarah's carefully constructed routine. Elevators carried streams of employees between floors, their conversations a steady murmur of business jargon and casual complaints about commute traffic. The 38th floor buzzed with the subdued energy of people settling into another day of analyzing numbers and managing other people's money. Sarah's supervisor, Margaret Thompson, was a 15-year veteran of the financial industry who ran the risk assessment department with the methodical precision of someone who believed that proper procedure could prevent any crisis. At 52, Margaret had built her career on being thorough, cautious, and completely predictable, qualities that made her an excellent manager for a department where innovation was less important than accuracy. Margaret's morning routine included a tour of the department, checking in with each analyst to review their current projects and ensure that everything was proceeding according to schedule. She reached Sarah's cubicle at approximately 10:15, carrying a steaming mug of coffee and a folder containing the day's priority assignments. "Morning, Sarah," Margaret said, settling into the visitor's chair beside Sarah's desk with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had conducted the same conversation hundreds of times. "How are we looking on the Henderson portfolio analysis? The client's getting nervous about exposure to emerging markets, and we need to have recommendations ready for this afternoon's meeting." Sarah pulled up the relevant files on her computer screen, gesturing toward the data tables she had been updating since arriving at work. "I've run the volatility models for all major holdings, and the risk levels are actually within acceptable parameters given current market conditions. The recent dip in the Asian markets is consistent with seasonal patterns, and historical data suggests we should see stabilization within the next 2 weeks. Margaret nodded approvingly, making notes in her ever-present planning calendar. "What about hedging strategies?" Mr. Henderson specifically asked about options for protecting against further downside risk. "I've identified 3 potential approaches," Sarah replied, clicking through to a different spreadsheet. "We could implement a put option strategy to limit losses, diversify into more stable sectors, or reduce overall exposure by reallocating to domestic investments. Each approach has different cost implications and risk profiles." As she explained the various scenarios, Sarah was aware of performing a role that had become second nature over the past 6 years. Her analysis was competent and thorough, exactly what Margaret expected from a senior analyst, but it required only a fraction of her intellectual capacity. The real Sarah Chen, the one who had once coordinated multi-agency operations involving dozens of federal agents, was capable of processing far more complex information under significantly greater pressure. But that Sarah Chen was supposed to be dead, buried beneath years of deliberate mediocrity and careful conformity. The woman sitting in this cubicle was exactly what she appeared to be, a skilled but unremarkable analyst who understood financial markets and risk management, but had never done anything more dangerous than present quarterly reports to skeptical executives. Margaret spent another 10 minutes reviewing project timelines and discussing upcoming deadlines, then moved on to David Nguyen's cubicle to conduct a similar check-in. Sarah watched her supervisor's methodical progress through the department, noting the familiar patterns of corporate life that had provided such comfortable anonymity for the past 6 years. The beauty of working in risk assessment was that it attracted people who were naturally cautious and analytical, personality traits that made them unlikely to ask probing questions about their colleagues' backgrounds. Everyone in the department was more interested in data than in personal relationships, more concerned with professional competence than with individual histories. It was the perfect environment for someone who needed to hide in plain sight. Sarah's computer chimed softly with an incoming email from the building's facilities management team, announcing scheduled maintenance on the HVAC system that might result in temporary temperature fluctuations throughout the day. She deleted the message without giving it much thought, unaware that the maintenance work would later become crucial to understanding how the building's ventilation system could be exploited by someone with technical knowledge and hostile intentions. Another email arrived from the security desk in the lobby, informing all tenants that visitor access procedures had been updated to include additional identification requirements for anyone not on the pre-approved guest list. Sarah read this message more carefully, her federal training automatically flagging any changes to security protocols as potentially significant, but the update seemed routine enough to dismiss as standard corporate caution. At 11:30, she received a phone call from a client who was concerned about recent performance in his international investment portfolio. Sarah spent 15 minutes walking him through the market factors that had contributed to temporary losses, explaining how diversification strategies were designed to minimize long-term risk even when short-term volatility created apparent setbacks. The conversation required patience and clear communication skills, but nothing that challenged her intellectually or emotionally. As she hung up the phone, Sarah reflected on how different this kind of problem-solving was from the life or death decision-making that had once defined her career. In her federal days, she had been responsible for analyzing complex tactical situations where incomplete information and time pressure made every choice potentially catastrophic. Now her biggest challenge was explaining market fluctuations to wealthy investors who were upset about quarterly returns. The transition had been difficult at first, requiring her to consciously suppress instincts and training responses that had become automatic after 12 years in federal service. She had spent months learning to think like a civilian, to approach problems with the methodical caution of corporate analysis rather than the rapid assessment and decisive action that characterized tactical operations. But 6 years of practice had made the transformation feel natural, even inevitable. Sarah could barely remember what it felt like to make split-second decisions that affected other people's lives, to carry the weight of operational responsibility that came with leading federal tactical teams. That part of her identity felt like something from another person's life, disconnected from the careful, predictable routine she had built at Whitmore Financial. Jennifer Walsh appeared at the entrance to Sarah's cubicle, carrying a stack of client files and wearing the slightly frazzled expression that usually meant she was dealing with particularly demanding investors. "Sarah, do you have a few minutes to help me understand some risk calculations? Mrs. Patterson is asking about correlation factors in her portfolio, and I want to make sure I'm explaining it correctly." Sarah gestured toward the visitor's chair, saving her work and turning to face Jennifer with the patient attention she had learned to project during these routine consultations. "What specifically is she concerned about?" She's noticed that several of her technology investments moved in the same direction during the market correction last month, and she's worried that her portfolio isn't as diversified as she thought. "It was," Jennifer explained, opening the client file and spreading several pages across Sarah's desk. "I told her that some correlation is normal, especially within the same sector, but she wants to know if we need to make adjustments." Sarah reviewed the portfolio composition, quickly identifying the correlation patterns that had triggered the client's concerns. She's right to notice the correlation, but it's actually within normal parameters for a portfolio with this level of technology exposure. The key is whether the correlation persists during different market conditions, not just during sector-specific corrections. As she walked Jennifer through the analysis, Sarah was aware of performing another routine consultation that had become second nature over the years. Her explanation was clear and thorough, addressing the client's concerns while providing enough technical detail to demonstrate expertise without overwhelming someone who lacked her analytical background. These interactions had taught her to communicate complex concepts in accessible language, a skill that was valuable in her current role but very different from the precise technical communication required in federal operations. In her tactical days, she had communicated with other trained professionals who shared her background and understood the specialized terminology of their field. Now she spent much of her time translating technical concepts for people whose expertise lay in completely different areas. Jennifer gathered her files and thanked Sarah for the explanation, returning to her own cubicle to continue preparing for her afternoon meeting with Mrs. Patterson. Sarah watched her colleague's departure, noting the relaxed confidence that came from knowing the information she needed was readily available from competent colleagues who were willing to share their expertise. It was the kind of collaborative environment that Sarah had never experienced during her federal career, where information was compartmentalized and shared only on a need-to-know basis. The openness and accessibility of corporate life had been one of the unexpected benefits of her transition, even though it sometimes made her nervous to be so visible and available to anyone who wanted to ask questions. The wall clock above the department entrance showed 11:45 when Sarah heard the first unusual sound, a sharp metallic click that didn't belong to the normal office environment. Her federal training automatically cataloged the sound as potentially significant, but her civilian mind dismissed it as probably maintenance work or someone dropping something in an adjacent cubicle. 2 minutes later, she heard it again, followed by a muffled voice speaking what sounded like commands, in a language she didn't immediately recognize. This time, her training overrode her civilian conditioning, and she found herself listening with the focused attention of someone who understood that unusual sounds could indicate developing threats. The building's ventilation system carried voices and sounds between floors in ways that most people didn't notice, but Sarah's tactical experience had taught her to pay attention to acoustic information that others would ignore. She could hear movement in stairwells, conversations in adjacent offices, and mechanical sounds from building systems that provided valuable intelligence about her environment. What she was hearing now didn't match any normal pattern of office activity. The voices were too controlled, too purposeful, and they seemed to be coordinating some kind of systematic movement through the building. Sarah felt the first flutter of concern, though she told herself it was probably just security guards conducting some kind of drill or maintenance workers following safety protocols. But her hands had stopped moving over the keyboard, and she realized she was listening with the intense focus of someone whose survival had once depended on processing audio intelligence accurately. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah Chen, the risk assessment analyst, was beginning to recede, replaced by someone whose instincts were far more dangerous. The public address system crackled to life at exactly 11:47, and everything changed. The voice that came through the building's speakers was calm, professional, and absolutely terrifying in its controlled authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is now a secure facility. All personnel will remain at their current locations and follow instructions precisely. Any deviation from these instructions will result in immediate consequences." Sarah's blood turned to ice as her federal training kicked into automatic threat assessment mode. The speaker's accent was Eastern European, possibly Serbian or Croatian, and his tone carried the unmistakable confidence of someone who had done this before. This wasn't a disgruntled employee or a random act of violence. This was a coordinated operation executed by professionals. Around her, the department erupted into confused murmurs and nervous laughter as her colleagues tried to process what they had just heard. Jennifer Walsh looked up from her desk with a puzzled expression, as if she couldn't quite believe what the announcement had implied. David Nguyen was already reaching for his phone, probably to call building security for clarification. "Everyone stay calm," Margaret Thompson called out, rising from her desk with the kind of authoritative composure that had made her an effective manager during mundane crises. "This is probably just a security drill. I'll call downstairs and find out what's happening." But Sarah knew with absolute certainty that this was no drill. The tactical precision of the announcement, the systematic way the building's communication system had been compromised, the coordination she had heard. In the stairwells moments before everything went quiet, someone had taken control of Meridian Tower, and they had done it with military efficiency. Her mind automatically began processing threat assessment protocols that she hadn't consciously accessed in 6 years. Multiple entry points would have been secured simultaneously to prevent escape or outside intervention. Communication systems would have been isolated to prevent calls for help. The building's security team would have been neutralized quickly and quietly to avoid alerting the occupants until the operation was fully in place. Margaret was speaking into her desk phone, but Sarah could see from her increasingly confused expression that the call wasn't connecting. The phone system had been disabled, which meant the attackers had either physical access to the building's infrastructure or sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. Either possibility suggested a level of planning and resources that made this far more serious than a simple robbery or act of domestic terrorism. "The phones aren't working," Margaret announced, trying to maintain her calm managerial tone, despite the obvious concern creeping into her voice. "I'm sure it's just a technical issue related to whatever security procedure they're conducting." Sarah stood up slowly, her movements carefully controlled to avoid attracting attention, while she conducted a more thorough assessment of their situation. The windows faced north toward the financial district, putting them on the opposite side of the building from the main entrance, where any law enforcement response would initially focus. The elevator banks were approximately 50 meters from their location, accessible through the main corridor that ran the length of the floor. Her cubicle was positioned near the emergency exit stairwell, a location she had specifically requested during her initial orientation 6 years ago. At the time, she had told herself it was just prudent planning, but now she realized her tactical instincts had been operating even when she was trying to suppress them. The emergency exit provided access to the building's fire stairs, which might still be unmonitored if the attackers were focusing their attention on the main access points. Everyone should just stay at their desks and wait for more information. Margaret continued, but her voice carried less conviction than before. She was beginning to understand that whatever was happening wasn't following any normal protocol for building emergencies or security procedures. Sarah's peripheral vision caught movement in the main corridor, and she turned slightly to get a better view without appearing to stare. 3 men in dark clothing were moving systematically from office to office, conducting what appeared to be a floor-by-floor search or securing operation. They moved with the disciplined coordination of military or law enforcement personnel, and Sarah could see the distinctive outlines of automatic weapons beneath their jackets. Her heart rate spiked as she recognized the tactical formation they were using, a standard room-clearing pattern that maximized coverage while minimizing exposure to potential threats. These weren't criminals or terrorists acting on ideological motivation. These were professionals executing a specific mission with clearly defined objectives. One of the men looked directly at her through the glass partition that separated the risk assessment department from the main corridor. His eyes were cold and calculating, conducting the kind of visual assessment that Sarah recognized from her own training in identifying potential threats among civilian populations. She forced herself to maintain the confused, anxious expression of a typical office worker while suppressing every instinct that wanted to analyze his equipment, estimate his experience level, and develop countermeasures. The man made a notation on a small device he was carrying, then gestured to his companions toward the next section of offices. They were conducting a census, cataloging the location and number of people on each floor. Sarah realized with growing dread that this wasn't a robbery or a political statement. This was a hostage situation, and the attackers were systematically securing their assets before moving to the next phase of their operation. Jennifer Walsh had noticed the men in the corridor and was pointing them out to David Nguyen with the kind of relieved recognition that came from seeing what appeared to be security personnel responding to the situation. "Look, there are the security guards. I told you this was just some kind of drill or emergency procedure." But Sarah could see details that her colleagues missed, the way the men carried themselves with tactical awareness rather than the casual alertness of building security, the military-grade communication equipment attached to their tactical vests, the systematic way they were documenting information rather than simply checking on occupant safety. "Those aren't security guards," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the nervous conversations happening throughout the department. David turned toward her with a confused expression. "What do you mean?" "They're obviously responding to whatever situation triggered that announcement." Sarah realized she had revealed more situational awareness than was appropriate for a risk assessment analyst who had never been trained in threat recognition. She needed to be more careful about suppressing her tactical instincts while still gathering the information necessary to understand what they were facing. "I mean, they don't look like the usual building security team," she said, modifying her response to sound like civilian observation rather than professional assessment. "I've seen the regular guards, and these men look different." Margaret Thompson was trying her cell phone now, but Sarah could see from her frustrated gestures that mobile service had also been disabled. The attackers had implemented a comprehensive communications blackout, isolating the building from outside contact while they completed their operation. Standard hostage-taking protocol was to establish complete control over the environment before making any demands or revealing their ultimate objectives. The public address system crackled again, and the same controlled voice delivered another, precisely worded announcement. Building occupants are reminded to remain in their current locations. Compliance with all instructions is mandatory. Building management and security are cooperating fully with current procedures. The mention of building management cooperation suggested that the attackers had secured the administrative offices and gained access to the building's control systems. They probably had hostages among the executive staff, which would give them significant leverage in any negotiations with law enforcement. Sarah felt a familiar weight settling in her stomach as she realized the scope and sophistication of the operation they were facing. Her colleagues were still trying to process the situation through the lens of normal office emergencies. They were looking for rational explanations that would allow them to continue believing they were safe, that whatever was happening would be resolved quickly through proper procedures and professional intervention. But Sarah's training had taught her to recognize the signs of a meticulously planned operation, executed by people who understood exactly what they were doing. The systematic isolation of communications, the coordinated deployment of personnel, the careful control of information flow. This was a textbook hostage-taking operation conducted by professionals who had studied similar incidents and learned from both successful and failed attempts. Margaret gathered the department staff for an impromptu meeting near the central workspace, her voice carrying forced optimism as she tried to maintain normal management protocols in an increasingly abnormal situation. "I know this is concerning, but I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for what's happening. The most important thing is that we stay calm and follow whatever instructions we receive from the authorities." Sarah joined the group while mentally calculating distances, egress routes, and potential defensive positions throughout the floor. Her risk assessment training provided perfect cover for the kind of analytical thinking that was actually tactical planning, allowing her to conduct a professional threat evaluation while appearing to participate in a routine staff meeting. Has anyone been able to reach the security desk or get through to anyone outside the building? Margaret asked, looking around the group for information that might clarify their situation. Everyone shook their heads or reported similar communication failures. The systematic isolation was complete, which meant the attackers had either significant technical resources or inside knowledge of the building's infrastructure. Sarah was beginning to develop a theory about who they might be facing, but she needed more information before drawing conclusions that could affect the safety of everyone. On the floor, David Nguyen raised his hand like a student seeking permission to speak, his normal corporate politeness incongruous in their current circumstances. "Should we try to evacuate through the emergency stairs? If there's really some kind of security situation, maybe we should get out of the building." Margaret looked uncertain, clearly struggling with a situation that fell far outside her experience in managing routine office operations. "I think we should wait for official instructions. If the authorities want us to evacuate, they'll make that clear through proper channels." Sarah knew that waiting for official instructions was exactly the wrong approach in a hostage situation, but she also knew that any attempt to advocate for immediate evacuation would reveal tactical knowledge that could compromise her carefully maintained cover. She was caught between her professional assessment of the threat and her need to remain invisible among her civilian colleagues. The sound of elevator doors opening in the main corridor drew everyone's attention, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the significance. The elevators had been disabled for civilian use, but someone with override access was now using them to transport personnel or equipment between floors. The operation was entering a new phase, which usually meant the attackers were moving from the securing phase to the control phase. 3 more men emerged from the elevator, But these were clearly different from the tactical team that had conducted the initial floor sweep. They wore business suits rather than tactical gear, carried briefcases instead of weapons, and moved with the confident authority of people accustomed to corporate environments. Sarah realized they were looking at a sophisticated operation that included both tactical personnel and what appeared to be negotiators or administrators. One of the suited men approached the glass partition of the risk assessment department and gestured for Margaret to join him in the corridor. His manner was polite, but unmistakably commanding, the kind of presence that automatically generated compliance from people accustomed to corporate hierarchies. Margaret looked around at her staff with visible uncertainty before walking toward the corridor to meet with the man. Sarah could see them speaking through the glass, though she couldn't hear the conversation over the nervous chatter of her colleagues. The man's body language was professional and non-threatening, but his positioning and hand gestures suggested he was delivering specific instructions that required immediate compliance. After several minutes of conversation, Margaret returned to the department with an expression that mixed relief with underlying concern. She gathered the staff again, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying to communicate important information without causing panic. That gentleman explained that there's been a security incident involving potential threats to several financial institutions in the city, she began, her words clearly rehearsed from the conversation she had just completed. As a precautionary measure, this building is being secured while law enforcement conducts their investigation. We're asked to remain in our current location until the all-clear is given. Sarah recognized the cover story as standard hostage-taking protocol designed to maintain calm among captives while the operation proceeded. The explanation was plausible enough to prevent panic, while vague enough to justify any unusual restrictions or requirements. Her colleagues nodded with visible relief, eager to accept an explanation that made their situation seem temporary and manageable. "Did he say how long this might take?" Jennifer asked, glancing toward the corridor where the suited man was now speaking with staff from the neighboring department. "He estimated several hours, possibly extending into the evening depending on the scope of the investigation," Margaret replied. "He assured me that we're completely safe and that cooperation with the security measures will help ensure everyone's safety." Sarah felt a chill as she recognized the timeline implications. A several-hour operation suggested something far more complex than a simple robbery or extortion attempt. The attackers were planning something that required extended control of the building and its occupants, which meant their objectives went beyond immediate financial gain. Her federal experience had taught her that extended hostage situations usually involved one of three scenarios: negotiations for the release of imprisoned associates, demands for political concessions that required time to coordinate or cover for a larger operation happening elsewhere. None of these possibilities offered much hope for a quick resolution or a safe outcome for the building's occupants. The suited man was now moving systematically through each department, delivering similar briefings to supervisors and establishing the communication protocols that would allow the attackers to maintain control over more than 1,000 people, spread across 10 floors. Sarah watched his progress and noted the careful attention he paid to documenting the location and number of people in each area. "I think we should try to contact our families," David suggested, pulling out his cell phone despite the earlier communication failures. "Even if the phones aren't working properly, maybe text messages are getting through." Margaret nodded approvingly, clearly grateful for any suggestion that maintained normal corporate problem-solving approaches. "That's a good idea. Everyone should try to let their families know they might be late getting home due to the security situation." Sarah knew that any attempt to communicate outside the building would be monitored and potentially used against them. But she also realized that discouraging such attempts would raise questions about how she knew standard hostage-taking protocols. She pulled out her own phone and made a show of attempting to send messages while actually conducting a more thorough assessment of their electronic isolation. The cell towers in the immediate area had been jammed or overwhelmed, creating a dead zone that prevented both voice calls and data transmission. The sophistication required for such comprehensive signal disruption suggested either significant electronic warfare capabilities or coordination with telecommunications infrastructure. Either possibility pointed toward attackers with resources and connections far beyond typical criminal organizations. Jennifer was holding her phone up toward the windows, trying to find a signal strong enough to send a text message to her husband. "I'm not getting any bars at all. The whole network must be overloaded with everyone trying to call at the same time." Sarah nodded sympathetically while mentally noting that the signal disruption was too complete and systematic to be explained by network overload. The attackers had implemented a comprehensive electronic isolation protocol that would prevent any communication between the building's occupants and the outside world until they chose to restore connectivity. The implications were sobering. Without outside communication, law enforcement would have difficulty gathering intelligence about the situation inside the building. Negotiation would be entirely controlled by the attackers, who could reveal or conceal information as it suited their purposes. Most importantly, any rescue operation would have to proceed without real-time intelligence about hostage locations or conditions. Margaret was trying to maintain normal departmental operations despite the increasingly abnormal circumstances. "Since it looks like we'll be here for a while, we might as well continue working on our current projects. The Henderson portfolio analysis still needs to be completed, and we have several client meetings scheduled for later this week." Sarah understood the psychological comfort that came from maintaining routine activities during stressful situations. But she also knew that their current circumstances made normal work both impossible and irrelevant. The attackers were allowing this illusion of normalcy to prevent panic and maintain order, but that tolerance would end once they moved to the next phase of their operation. She made a show of returning to her computer while actually using her workstation to conduct a more sophisticated analysis of their situation. Her risk assessment software provided tools for modeling complex scenarios with multiple variables, capabilities that she could adapt to develop tactical assessments without revealing her true expertise. The building's internal network was still functioning, which gave her access to directory information, floor plans, and security protocols that might prove valuable if the situation deteriorated further. She began documenting the location of emergency equipment, alternative exit routes, and communication systems that might be less obvious to attackers focused on the primary building infrastructure. Her computer screen displayed financial risk models and market analysis reports, but Sarah was actually creating a comprehensive threat assessment that cataloged everything she had observed about the attackers' capabilities, organization, and operational protocols. Her federal training had taught her to gather intelligence continuously, even in situations where immediate action wasn't possible. The suited man had completed his circuit of the floor and was now establishing a command post near the main elevator bank. Sarah could see him unpacking sophisticated communication equipment and setting up what appeared to be a coordination center for managing the building's occupants. The professional efficiency of his setup suggested extensive experience in organizing large-scale operations. Two of the tactical personnel had taken positions near the emergency exits, not obviously threatening but positioned to monitor and control any movement toward potential escape routes. Their placement was casual enough to avoid causing alarm among the office workers, but tactical enough to provide effective coverage of all egress points. Sarah realized that her colleagues were gradually settling into acceptance of their situation, treating it as an unusual but manageable disruption to their normal routine. They were adapting to the restrictions and explanations they had been given, finding ways to remain productive and comfortable while waiting for the situation to resolve itself. but her tactical analysis suggested that they were in the early stages of a complex operation that would likely become more restrictive and more dangerous as it progressed. The attackers had established control and were now moving toward whatever objectives had motivated them to take such significant risks and deploy such extensive resources. The afternoon stretched ahead with an ominous sense of building tension that only Sarah seemed to recognize. Her colleagues continued working, chatting, and trying to maintain normalcy, while she sat among them like a hidden weapon, waiting for the moment when her true capabilities would become necessary for their survival. That moment was coming sooner than anyone realized. 3 hours into the lockdown, the careful facade of cooperation began to crumble. Sarah watched through the glass partition as the suited coordinator received what appeared to be urgent communication. Through his tactical headset, his controlled demeanor shifted subtly, and she recognized the body language of someone receiving information that didn't match his operational expectations. The coordinator spoke rapidly into his microphone, his voice too low to be audible, but his gestures increasingly animated. Something had gone wrong with whatever larger plan this operation was meant to support. Sarah's federal experience had taught her that complex operations were vulnerable to cascading failures, and she could see the signs of mounting pressure in the way that tactical personnel were repositioning themselves throughout the floor. Margaret Thompson had been trying to maintain normal departmental operations, but the pretense was becoming increasingly difficult as hours passed without any sign of resolution. Jennifer Walsh was openly anxious now, repeatedly checking her phone and glancing toward the corridor where the attackers maintained their visible presence. David Nguyen had given up any attempt to work and was sitting at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. The public address system crackled again, but this time the voice carried an edge of urgency that hadn't been present in the earlier announcements. All personnel are advised that security protocols have been elevated due to developing circumstances. Compliance with all instructions is now mandatory and immediate. Any unauthorized movement or communication attempts will be met with appropriate response. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she recognized the shift in tone. The operation was moving from the control phase to the pressure phase, which meant the attackers were either facing external complications or preparing to escalate their demands. Either scenario significantly increased the danger for everyone in the building. Around her, the department staff exchanged worried glances as the implications of the announcement began to sink in. Margaret stood up from her desk, clearly struggling to maintain her managerial authority in a situation that had moved far beyond normal corporate crisis management protocols. "I think I should try to get more information from that security coordinator," Margaret said, her voice betraying the strain of trying to project confidence she clearly didn't feel. "We need to understand what's happening and how long this is going to continue." But as Margaret approached the glass partition, one of the tactical personnel intercepted her with a gesture that was polite but unmistakably commanding. Sarah could see the brief conversation through the glass, watching Margaret's expression shift from confused concern to visible fear as she understood that her movement was being restricted rather than simply monitored. Margaret returned to the department with her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. She gathered the staff again, but this time her voice carried none of the false optimism that had characterized her earlier briefings. "The security coordinator informed me that the situation has become more complex," she said carefully, clearly choosing her words to avoid causing panic while conveying the seriousness of their circumstances. "We're asked to remain in the department until further notice. No one should attempt to leave this area for any reason." Jennifer Walsh raised her hand with the automatic politeness of someone still trying to process the situation through normal social conventions. "What about using the restroom? Surely we're allowed basic facilities." Margaret shook her head, her expression grim. "He said all movement outside the department is temporarily restricted. They'll provide guidance about facilities and other necessities as the situation develops." Sarah realized that the attackers had moved from passive control to active containment, which meant they were either facing pressure from law enforcement or preparing for a phase of their operation that required tighter security. Either possibility suggested that the situation was about to deteriorate significantly. Her federal training kicked into high gear as she began calculating the resources and options available for protecting her colleagues if the situation escalated further. 23 people in the department, including herself. Limited egress routes, all of which were now monitored. No communication with the outside world. No weapons or defensive equipment beyond improvised items available in a typical office environment. The tactical assessment was sobering. If the attackers decided to use force against the hostages, there would be little that untrained civilians could do to protect themselves. Sarah's specialized skills might allow her to neutralize individual threats, but any action on her part would expose her true identity and potentially trigger retaliation against her colleagues. She was trapped between her professional instincts and her carefully constructed cover, knowing that revealing her capabilities might save lives in the short term but could also escalate the overall situation in ways that endangered everyone in the building. The calculus was complex and shifting, requiring her to continuously assess threat levels against potential responses. The coordinator in the corridor was receiving more frequent communications now, and Sarah could see him consulting what appeared to be building schematics on a tablet device. He was coordinating with personnel throughout the building, managing an operation that clearly involved far more people and resources than were visible on their floor. David Nguyen had been watching the coordinator's activities and turned toward Sarah with the kind of analytical observation that made him effective in regulatory compliance. Have you noticed that they seem to be paying particular attention to the building's infrastructure? That man has been consulting technical diagrams for the past hour. Sarah had indeed noticed, and her tactical experience suggested several disturbing possibilities. The attackers might be planning to disable building systems to increase pressure on law enforcement negotiators. They might be preparing escape routes that utilize service areas or utility corridors. Most concerning, they might be planning to use the building's infrastructure as leverage in ways that could endanger the structural integrity of the entire facility. Maybe they're just trying to understand the building's layout for security purposes. She replied carefully, suppressing the urge to share her more sophisticated threat analysis. Security procedures probably require them to know about all the building's systems. But even as she said it, Sarah was conducting her own analysis of the building's vulnerabilities based on the infrastructure information she had accessed through her computer workstation. The Meridian Tower was a modern high-rise with sophisticated climate control, electrical distribution, and communication systems that could be exploited by someone with technical knowledge and hostile intentions. The elevator system could be programmed to restrict movement between floors. The fire suppression system could be activated to create confusion and limit visibility. The emergency lighting could be disabled to create tactical advantages for attackers equipped with night vision equipment. Most concerning, the building's structural support systems could potentially be damaged in ways that would make evacuation impossible. Her risk assessment training provided perfect cover for this kind of analytical thinking, allowing her to develop comprehensive threat models while appearing to simply conduct the kind of systematic analysis that characterized her normal work. But the conclusions she was reaching were far more alarming than anything she could share with her civilian colleagues. Jennifer Walsh was becoming increasingly agitated, pacing near her desk and repeatedly attempting to use her phone despite the obvious communication blackout. This doesn't make sense. If this is really just a security investigation, why are they treating us like prisoners? Why can't we contact our families or use the restroom or get any real information about what's happening? Margaret tried to provide reassurance, but her own anxiety was becoming more apparent as the hours passed. I'm sure there are good reasons for the precautions they're taking. Security situations can be very complex, and they probably need to follow strict protocols to ensure everyone's safety. But Sarah could see that Margaret was struggling to maintain her belief in the official explanation. The restrictions were becoming too comprehensive and too indefinite to be explained by routine security procedures. Her colleagues were beginning to understand that their situation was far more serious than they had initially been told. The coordinator's radio crackled with urgent communication that was audible throughout the department, though the technical terminology and coded language made it incomprehensible to civilian listeners. Sarah's federal training allowed her to recognize some of the tactical terminology, and what she heard increased her concern about the operation's scope and objectives. References to primary extraction and secondary containment suggested a multi-phase operation with clearly defined objectives that went beyond simple hostage-taking. Mentions of external coordination implied that this building was only one component of a larger plan involving multiple locations or organizations. Most alarming, discussions of timeline acceleration suggested that external pressure was forcing the attackers to modify their original plan in ways that might increase the danger for everyone involved. Sarah's phone buzzed with what appeared to be an incoming text message, despite the communication blackout that had prevented all previous attempts to contact the outside world. She glanced at the screen and felt her blood turn cold as she read a message that changed everything. Agent Chen, your location has been identified. Recommend immediate tactical assessment and preparation for emergency intervention. Support. Assets are positioned but unable to establish direct communication. Acknowledge receipt with standard protocol. The message was from a number she didn't recognize, but the terminology and format were unmistakably federal. Someone in law enforcement or intelligence had identified her location and was requesting tactical intelligence from inside the building. Her cover had been blown, but by people who were trying to help rather than harm. Sarah deleted the message immediately while her mind raced through the implications. Federal assets were positioned outside the building, which meant this operation had attracted the attention of agencies with resources and capabilities beyond local law enforcement. Her former colleagues were requesting intelligence that could support a rescue operation, but any response would confirm her presence and potentially compromise her safety if the communication was intercepted. The standard protocol for acknowledging receipt was a simple numeric code that would confirm her identity without revealing operational details. But sending any response would cross a line that she had spent 6 years avoiding, pulling her back into the world of federal operations and tactical decision-making that she had tried so hard to escape. Margaret was attempting to organize the department staff into some semblance of normal activity, assigning people to work on various projects as a way of maintaining focus and reducing anxiety. But the pretense was becoming increasingly hollow. As the restrictions tightened and the hours stretched without any sign of resolution. Sarah, could you work on updating the Morrison portfolio analysis? Margaret asked, her voice carrying forced normalcy. The client meeting has obviously been postponed, but we'll need to have the information ready when this situation is resolved. Sarah nodded and returned to her computer, but instead of opening client files, she accessed the building's internal network to gather more detailed intelligence about their situation. Her workstation provided access to security camera feeds, building system controls, and communication logs that could provide valuable tactical information for any rescue operation. The security cameras showed tactical personnel positioned throughout the building in a pattern that suggested they were prepared for external assault rather than simply containing hostages. Stairwells were monitored, roof access was secured, and the main lobby had been fortified with improvised barriers that would slow any attempt at forcible entry. Building system logs showed that environmental controls had been modified to limit air circulation, potentially as preparation for deploying chemical agents that would incapacitate hostages or attackers. Elevator programming had been changed to prevent unauthorized access, creating isolation between floors that would complicate any rescue attempt. Most concerning, the communication logs showed extensive coordination with external parties, using encrypted channels that suggested sophisticated intelligence capabilities. This wasn't an isolated criminal operation. It was part of a larger plan that involved multiple organizations and significant resources. Sarah's federal experience allowed her to recognize the operational signature of a state-sponsored or intelligence-related operation. The level of planning, the quality of equipment, and the systematic approach to controlling a complex environment all pointed toward attackers with training and support that went far beyond typical criminal organizations. Her phone buzzed again with another message. Tactical assessment urgent. External breach planned for 1800 hours. Hostage location and threat identification critical for mission success. Lives depend on immediate intelligence. The timestamp showed 1800 hours was less than 2 hours away. Federal assets were planning a rescue operation, and they needed her intelligence to minimize casualties during the assault. But providing that intelligence would require her to abandon her cover and actively participate in tactical operations for the first time in 6 years. Sarah stared at her computer screen, paralyzed by the weight of a decision that would determine not only her own fate, but potentially the lives of everyone in the building. Her colleagues continued their anxious conversations around her, unaware that their survival might depend on whether she was willing to become the person she had spent 6 years trying to forget. The coordinator in the corridor was receiving more frequent and urgent communications, and Sarah could see him consulting his tablet with increasing agitation. Whatever timeline the attackers had been following was clearly being disrupted by external developments, creating pressure that would likely result in escalated demands or threats. Jennifer Walsh approached Sarah's cubicle with visible desperation in her expression. "Sarah, you're good with technical analysis. Do you think there's any way we could get a message out to our families? Maybe through the building's computer system or some kind of emergency communication that these security people haven't disabled." The request was innocent enough, but it forced Sarah to confront the gap between her apparent expertise and her actual capabilities. Her colleagues saw her as someone skilled in data analysis and risk assessment, but they had no idea that she possessed sophisticated knowledge of communication systems, electronic warfare, and tactical operations. The building's network is probably isolated from external connections, she replied carefully, providing accurate information while concealing the extent of her technical knowledge. Security protocols for this kind of situation usually require complete communication control. But even as she spoke, Sarah was evaluating the technical possibilities for establishing covert communication with federal assets outside the building. Her workstation had access to building systems that might be exploited to create alternative communication channels, but any such attempt would require her to reveal capabilities that would immediately compromise her cover. The afternoon light filtering through the windows was beginning to fade, and Sarah realized that the approaching evening would provide tactical advantages for any rescue operation. Reduced visibility would complicate the attacker's ability to monitor external approaches, while sophisticated night vision equipment would give federal assault teams significant advantages in close-quarters combat. But darkness would also provide cover for the attackers to escalate their operations in ways that might endanger the hostages. The timeline was accelerating toward a confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone in the building, and Sarah was the only person with the training and knowledge necessary to influence the outcome. Her phone displayed another message. "Agent Chun, situation critical. Immediate response required. Acknowledge if operational." The word operational carried specific meaning in federal terminology. Her former colleagues were asking whether she was prepared to resume tactical duties in support of the rescue mission. They were requesting her to cross the line from protected civilian back to active federal agent, with all the responsibilities and dangers that transition would entail. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she considered her response. Around her, 22 innocent people continued their anxious wait, trusting that someone would rescue them from a situation they couldn't understand or control. Outside the building, federal agents were preparing to risk their lives in an operation that could save or doom everyone involved. The decision was hers, and time was running out. Sarah's fingers hovered over her phone keyboard as the weight of 6 years suddenly lifted from her shoulders. The woman who had spent so long hiding behind spreadsheets and risk assessments was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some responsibilities were too important to refuse. She typed the federal acknowledgement code with steady hands, accepting the call to become operational once again. The response came immediately. SITREP required. Hostage count, threat assessment, structural intelligence. Breach in 90 minutes. Sarah glanced around the department, noting her colleagues' positions while conducting the systematic threat evaluation that had once been second nature. She began typing rapidly, her fingers translating years of tactical training into concise intelligence that could save lives. 23 hostages this floor. Minimum 6 tangos visible, likely 12 total building-wide. Professional operators, Eastern European accents, sophisticated equipment. Elevators disabled, stairwells monitored. Building systems compromised for chemical deployment potential. Recommend northeast stairwell breach, floors 38 through 40. Hostages concentrated central areas each floor. As she transmitted the intelligence, Sarah felt the familiar clarity that came with accepting dangerous responsibility. The fear and doubt that had paralyzed her decision-making evaporated, replaced by the cold tactical focus that had made her legendary among her federal colleagues. Margaret Thompson was trying to maintain departmental order, but her efforts were becoming increasingly futile as the afternoon wore on without resolution. The coordinator in the corridor was receiving constant communications now, and even civilian observers could recognize the signs of mounting pressure in his increasingly animated responses. "Sarah," Jennifer Walsh said quietly, approaching her cubicle with visible desperation. "I know you're good with computers and analysis. Is there anything you can figure out about what's really happening here? Because I don't think anyone is telling us the truth." For the first time in 6 years, Sarah allowed her professional assessment to show in her expression. "You're right to be concerned. This isn't a routine security investigation. These are professional operators conducting a coordinated hostage operation, and the situation is about to escalate significantly." Jennifer stared at her with shock, clearly unprepared for such a direct and informed response. "How do you know that? What kind of risk assessment training teaches you to recognize professional operators?" Sarah realized that her transformation was becoming visible to her colleagues, but the operational timeline no longer allowed for maintaining her civilian cover. "The kind of training that might keep us alive over the next hour. I need you to trust me and follow my instructions exactly, without asking questions that I can't answer right now." Margaret overheard the conversation and approached with the worried expression of a manager trying to maintain control over circumstances that had moved far beyond normal corporate protocols. "Sarah, what are you talking about? What kind of instructions?" "In approximately 1 hour, federal agents are going to breach this building to rescue us," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to briefing tactical operations. "When that happens, we need to be positioned to protect ourselves from crossfire and assist the rescue team in identifying threats versus hostages." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming the dynamic of the entire department. As her colleagues struggled to process what they had just heard, David Nguyen was staring at her with open confusion, clearly trying to reconcile the quiet analyst he had worked with for 3 years with the person who was calmly discussing federal Rescue operations. Sarah, Margaret said slowly, how do you know about federal rescue operations? What exactly is your background? Sarah met her supervisor's eyes with steady confidence, no longer hiding behind the carefully constructed facade that had protected her for so long. My background is classified, but I can tell you that I have experience with tactical situations and hostage rescue operations. Right now, that experience is the most valuable asset we have for surviving what's about to happen. Jennifer Walsh stepped back with visible alarm, as if she was seeing Sarah for the first time. You're not really a risk assessment analyst, are you? You're some kind of federal agent or military operative. I'm someone who's going to help keep you alive, Sarah replied, her attention already shifting to tactical preparations rather than personal explanations. We need to move everyone away from the windows and position them in areas that provide cover from potential gunfire. The rescue operation will create significant danger until the threats are neutralized. Her phone buzzed with another update. External surveillance confirms chemical deployment preparation. Tactical teams equipped for contaminated environment. Recommend immediate shelter protocols for hostages. Sarah felt a chill as she realized the full scope of the danger they were facing. The attackers were preparing to deploy chemical agents that could incapacitate or kill the hostages, either as leverage against the rescue operation or as cover for their own escape. The federal assault teams were equipped for chemical threats, but the hostages had no protection beyond whatever shelter they could improvise. Everyone needs to move to the interior conference room immediately, Sarah announced, her voice carrying unmistakable command authority. Bring water bottles, any first aid supplies, and anything that can be used to seal gaps around doors and windows. We have very little time. Margaret started to protest the sudden change in authority, but something in Sarah's expression convinced her that this wasn't the time for normal management protocols. Why the conference room? What's happening that requires us to shelter? Chemical weapons, Sarah said bluntly, moving quickly to gather emergency supplies from the department's first aid station. The attackers have the capability to deploy chemical agents through the building's ventilation system. The conference room has independent air circulation that might provide some protection. The announcement galvanized her colleagues into immediate action, though their movements carried the confused urgency of people following instructions they didn't fully understand. David Nguyen began gathering water bottles from the office refrigerator, while Jennifer Walsh collected the small medical kit that the department kept for minor injuries. Sarah was conducting her own systematic collection of materials that could be adapted for tactical purposes. Office supplies could be used to seal ventilation gaps, furniture could provide improvised cover from gunfire, and communication equipment might allow contact with the rescue teams during the operation. Her phone displayed another message. Breach initiated. Maintain hostage position central location. Federal identification will be announced. Compliance essential for safety. Federal rescue teams are entering the building now, Sarah announced, her voice cutting through the nervous activity of her colleagues. When they reach this floor, they'll identify themselves as federal agents. Everyone needs to remain calm, keep their hands visible, and follow their instructions immediately. Margaret Thompson was struggling to process the transformation of her quiet analyst into someone who seemed to know more about their situation than the supposed security coordinators. Sarah, I don't understand what's happening. How do you know about rescue operations and chemical weapons and federal procedures? Because 12 years ago, I was the one conducting rescue operations, Sarah replied, no longer hiding the truth that had defined her for so long. I was a federal agent specializing in hostage rescue and counter-terrorism. I've been hiding that background, but our current situation makes concealment impossible. The revelation sent shockwaves through the group as her colleagues tried to reconcile this information with everything they thought they knew about Sarah Chen. David Nguyen was staring at her with something approaching awe. while Jennifer Walsh looked almost betrayed by the discovery that her quiet coworker had been living a complete fiction. The sounds of gunfire echoed through the building, distant but unmistakable evidence that the federal assault was encountering armed resistance. Sarah's tactical instincts automatically analyzed the acoustic signature, identifying the weapons being used and estimating the intensity of the engagement based on the rate and pattern of fire. "Automatic weapons, probably assault rifles," she said calmly, responding to the fearful expressions of her colleagues. "The rescue teams are equipped with superior training and equipment. The engagement should be resolved quickly in our favor." But even as she provided reassurance, Sarah was calculating the tactical variables that could complicate the rescue operation. The building's layout provided numerous defensive positions for the attackers, while the presence of hostages limited the federal team's ability to use overwhelming force. The chemical threat added another layer of complexity that could turn a straightforward rescue into a disaster. Her phone buzzed with an urgent update. "Chemical deployment detected floors 39 and 40. Shelter in place immediately. Decontamination teams standing by." Sarah felt her heart skip as she realized the attackers had begun their chemical attack on the floors, directly above and below their location. The timing suggested they were trying to create a buffer zone around the floor containing the most valuable hostages, using chemical weapons to prevent federal teams from establishing secure positions for a systematic assault. "Chemical attack in progress on adjacent floors," she announced, her voice remaining steady despite the escalating danger. "Everyone into the conference room now. Seal all gaps around doors and windows with whatever materials we have available." The department staff moved with desperate efficiency, understanding that their survival now depended on following instructions from someone whose expertise they were only beginning to comprehend. Margaret Thompson was helping to seal ventilation gaps with tape and paper, while David Nguyen positioned furniture to create barriers against potential chemical infiltration. Sarah was conducting her own assessment of the conference room's defensive capabilities, noting sight lines, potential entry points, and improvised weapons that could be used if the situation deteriorated further. Her federal training provided tactical knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death, but it also carried the weight of responsibility for decisions that would affect everyone's survival. The gunfire was getting closer now, and Sarah could distinguish between the different weapon signatures as federal teams engaged the attackers throughout the building. The tactical precision of the federal assault was evident in the systematic way the engagement was moving from floor to floor, but the defenders were clearly prepared for this kind of confrontation. Jennifer Walsh was sitting against the far wall of the conference room, her face pale with fear and confusion. "Sarah, are we going to survive this? I have 2 children at home who need their mother." Sarah met her colleague's eyes with the kind of steady confidence that had once reassured federal agents facing similar dangers. "We're going to survive this because federal rescue teams are among the best trained professionals in the world, and because we're taking the right precautions to protect ourselves until they can reach us." But privately, Sarah was calculating the probability of successful extraction given the chemical threat, the defensive preparations of the attackers, and the complexity of conducting rescue operations in a high-rise environment. The variables were numerous and constantly changing, requiring continuous tactical assessment and adaptation. Her phone displayed a final message: "Floor 38 secured. Federal agents inbound. Maintain position and await identification." Sarah felt a wave of relief as she realized that the rescue teams had fought their way to their floor and neutralized the immediate threats. "Federal agents are on this floor now. When they reach our location, everyone needs to remain calm and follow their instructions exactly." The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor was accompanied by authoritative voices announcing federal identification. Sarah recognized the tactical protocols being followed. understanding that the rescue teams were conducting systematic room-by-room clearance to ensure that all threats had been eliminated. Federal agents, building is secure. All hostages remain in place and await further instructions. Margaret Thompson looked toward Sarah with an expression that mixed gratitude with lingering confusion about everything that had just been revealed. "Sarah, I don't know who you really are, but thank you for getting us through this." Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of completion that had been missing from her life for 6 years. "I'm exactly who I've always been. I just stopped hiding it when hiding became more dangerous than being visible." The conference room door opened to reveal federal agents in tactical gear, their weapons lowered but ready as they conducted final security sweeps. The lead agent looked directly at Sarah with recognition that confirmed her transition from hidden civilian back to acknowledged professional. "Agent Chen, good to see you operational again. Your intelligence was crucial for mission success." As the rescue teams began evacuating the hostages, Sarah realized that her 6 years of hiding were permanently over. Her colleagues now knew the truth about her background. Federal agencies had her current location and identity, and her carefully constructed civilian life would never be possible again. But for the first time since Operation Nightfall, Sarah felt truly at peace with who she was and what she was capable of accomplishing. The skills and experience that had once been a source of guilt and trauma had become the tools that saved her colleagues' lives. Jennifer Walsh approached her as they prepared to evacuate, her expression still showing confusion but also genuine gratitude. "Sarah, I don't understand everything that happened today, but I know you saved our lives. What happens to you now?" Sarah looked around the conference room where 23 people had survived a sophisticated terrorist attack because someone with the right training had been in the right place at the right time. "I think it's time for me to stop pretending to be someone else and start using my experience to help people again." As they were escorted from the building, Sarah caught sight of Margaret Thompson speaking with federal debriefing officers, clearly trying to process the revelation that her quiet risk assessment analyst was actually a decorated federal agent. David Nguyen was answering questions about the day's events, occasionally glancing toward Sarah with newfound respect and curiosity. The transition back to operational status felt natural in a way that surprised Sarah after 6 years of civilian life. The tactical awareness, the rapid decision-making, the responsibility for other people's safety. These weren't burdens she had escaped. They were capabilities she had temporarily suppressed. Outside the building, emergency vehicles lined the streets, and federal command centers coordinated the massive response to what had been revealed as an international terrorism incident. Sarah was debriefed by agents she had once worked alongside, colleagues who welcomed her back with professional respect and personal warmth. 3 weeks later, Sarah received a job offer from the FBI's Critical Incident Response Group, leading a team that specialized in corporate security assessment and executive protection. Her experience in both federal operations and corporate environments made her uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between tactical capabilities and business world requirements. She accepted the position with the understanding that her days of hiding were permanently over, but also with the knowledge that her skills and experience could make a real difference in protecting people from threats they couldn't recognize or defend against themselves. Jennifer Walsh sent her a text message on her first day in the new position. "Thank you for showing us that heroes sometimes hide in plain sight until the moment when hiding becomes impossible. Good luck saving more lives." Sarah smiled as she read the message, understanding that her transformation from ghost to guardian was complete. The woman who had once tried to disappear into corporate anonymity had become someone who would never again hide from the responsibilities that came with exceptional capabilities. Some legends were meant to stay buried, but others were meant to rise when people needed them most. 6 months after the Meridian Tower incident, Sarah Chen stood in front of a conference room filled with corporate executives. who had no idea they were looking at the woman who had saved 17 lives by rappelling down 42 floors of a burning building. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was once again in a corporate environment, but this time her federal credentials were displayed prominently on the wall behind her. The executives from Pinnacle Industries shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs as Sarah clicked through surveillance photos that showed armed individuals conducting reconnaissance around their headquarters building. These weren't the kind of threats that typical corporate security was equipped to handle, which was exactly why the FBI's Corporate Protection Unit had been called in. The pattern of surveillance suggests a coordinated intelligence gathering operation targeting your executive team, Sarah explained, her voice carrying the authoritative calm that had become her trademark. The individuals conducting this surveillance have training consistent with foreign intelligence operatives, not domestic criminals or disgruntled employees. CEO Marcus Whitfield leaned forward with the intense focus of someone who had built a billion-dollar technology company by paying attention to details that others missed. Agent Chen, what exactly are you recommending? We can't shut down operations every time someone takes photographs of our building. Sarah advanced to the next slide, which showed a tactical assessment of the building's vulnerabilities that would have been impossible for anyone without her unique combination of federal training and corporate experience. I'm recommending a comprehensive security upgrade that addresses both physical vulnerabilities and operational protocols. Your current security measures are adequate for typical corporate threats, but insufficient for the kind of sophisticated operation we're potentially facing. The transformation from hidden analyst to acknowledged expert had been easier than Sarah had expected, largely because her years in corporate environments had taught her how to communicate complex tactical concepts to people without specialized backgrounds. She could explain the nuances of surveillance detection and threat assessment in language that corporate executives understood, bridging the gap between federal capabilities and business requirements. Her phone buzzed with a priority message from FBI headquarters, and Sarah glanced at the screen to see an urgent request for tactical consultation on a developing situation in Chicago. Another corporate hostage scenario where her unique expertise could make the difference between successful resolution and tragedy. Gentlemen, I need to interrupt this briefing for an urgent federal matter, Sarah announced, already calculating travel time and operational requirements for the Chicago situation. My team will continue with the security assessment recommendations, and I'll follow up with you tomorrow to finalize implementation details. As she gathered her materials, Marcus Whitfield stood and extended his hand with genuine respect. Agent Chen, I've worked with a lot of security consultants over the years, but I've never met anyone who understands both sides of this equation the way you do. Whatever the Bureau is paying you, it's not enough. Sarah smiled, remembering a time when corporate executives had dismissed her as just another maintenance worker who didn't understand the complexities of their business world. Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. The work is its own reward. The flight to Chicago gave Sarah time to review the tactical briefing for the developing situation. A foreign delegation visiting a major financial institution had been taken hostage by what appeared to be a sophisticated terrorist cell with inside knowledge of the building's security systems. The parallels to the Meridian Tower incident were obvious, but Sarah understood that no two operations were identical. Her reputation for successfully resolving complex hostage situations had spread throughout federal law enforcement, leading to consultation requests from agencies across the country. The combination of her tactical expertise and her understanding of corporate environments made her uniquely valuable for incidents involving business targets. Landing at O'Hare Airport, Sarah was met by Agent Michael Rodriguez from the Chicago field office, a 20-year veteran who had specifically requested her involvement based on reports from the Meridian Tower operation. Agent Chen, we've got 12 hostages including the British Trade Minister and the CEO of Consolidated Banking. The attackers have demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of the building's systems and appear to be prepared for extended siege conditions. Sarah reviewed the tactical briefing during the drive to the command center, noting the operational similarities to her own experience while identifying key differences that would require adjusted approaches. What's the communication status? Have they made any demands or provided any indication of their objectives? Radio silence for the past 4 hours. Rodriguez replied, his expression grim. They've disabled the building's communication systems and established their own encrypted network that we haven't been able to penetrate. Classic isolation protocol for a professional operation. The command center was a mobile operations facility, positioned 3 blocks from the target building, equipped with surveillance technology and tactical planning capabilities that represented significant advances over the equipment available during Sarah's own hostage experience. She was impressed by the technological sophistication, while noting that the fundamental challenges of hostage rescue remained unchanged. Sarah spent the next 2 hours developing a comprehensive tactical assessment that drew on her experience from both sides of hostage situations. Her analysis identified vulnerabilities in the attacker's positioning that could be exploited by federal assault teams, while also highlighting potential risks to hostage safety that might not be obvious to agents who had never been captives themselves. The key insight is that extended siege conditions actually work in our favor, Sarah explained to the assembled tactical team. Professional hostage takers expect quick resolution through negotiation or immediate assault. The longer we delay, the more likely they are to make mistakes or reveal weaknesses in their operational security. The team leader, Agent Jennifer Walsh, nodded approvingly. It was only after several minutes that Sarah realized the significance of the name, remembering her former colleague from Whitmore Financial who had sent her that grateful text message months earlier. The coincidence seemed appropriate somehow, a reminder of how interconnected the world of federal operations could become. The tactical briefing continued for another hour, with Sarah providing insights that helped refine the rescue plan based on her understanding of how buildings could be exploited by both attackers and defenders. Her corporate experience had taught her to think systematically about infrastructure vulnerabilities, while her federal training provided the tactical knowledge to address those vulnerabilities operationally. At 1400 hours, the assault teams moved into position for a coordinated breach that would occur simultaneously from multiple entry points. Sarah remained in the command center, providing real-time tactical analysis based on surveillance feeds and communication intercepts that revealed how the operation was developing. The rescue was executed with precision that reflected months of planning and coordination between multiple federal agencies. All 12 hostages were extracted safely while the attackers were either captured or neutralized without any casualties among the rescue teams. The operation became a textbook example of successful hostage rescue that would be studied in federal training programs for years to come. During the post-operation debriefing, Agent Rodriguez thanked Sarah for her contributions while noting that her tactical insights had been crucial for minimizing risks to both hostages and rescue personnel. Agent Chen, I've been involved in dozens of these operations over my career, but I've never seen tactical analysis that was so precisely tailored to the specific operational environment. Your corporate background gives you perspective that pure federal training can't provide. Sarah reflected on how her 6 years of corporate exile had actually prepared her for this moment, providing knowledge and insights that made her more effective as a federal agent than she had ever been before. Her transformation. The skills and experience she had gained in both worlds had combined to create capabilities that were truly unique within federal law enforcement. The flight back to Washington gave her time to consider how dramatically her life had changed since that morning at Meridian Tower when she had been forced to choose between maintaining her cover and saving her colleagues' lives. The decision to become operational again had led to a career that was more fulfilling and more impactful than anything she had previously imagined. Her apartment in Alexandria reflected her new identity as someone who no longer needed to hide her federal background. Commendations and certificates were displayed prominently on the walls, while tactical manuals and corporate security journals occupied the same bookshelf in easy coexistence. She had finally achieved integration between all aspects of her identity and experience. The next morning brought another consultation request, this time from a technology company in Silicon Valley that was concerned about threats to their research and development operations. Sarah packed her travel bag with the efficient routine of someone who had found her true calling in work that combined tactical expertise with corporate understanding. As her plane lifted off from Reagan National Airport, Sarah looked down at the city where she had spent 6 years hiding from her own capabilities and talents. The woman who had once been afraid to use her skills was now traveling across the country to help protect people who were facing threats they couldn't understand or defend against themselves. Her phone displayed a text message from Jennifer Walsh, her former colleague from Whitmore Financial, who had recently joined the FBI's Corporate Protection Unit, inspired by Sarah's example. Mentor, ready for my first tactical consultation. Thank you for showing me that careers can have second chapters that are better than the first. Sarah smiled as she typed her response, understanding that her transformation had inspired others to consider how their own skills and experience could be used to make a difference in protecting people from threats that were becoming increasingly sophisticated and dangerous. The Corporate Protection Unit had grown from a small specialized team to a major federal initiative, largely because of the success Sarah had demonstrated in bridging the gap between tactical capabilities and corporate security requirements. Her approach had proven that federal agents with business experience could provide protection services that were far more effective than traditional security measures. Looking ahead, Sarah could see a future where her unique combination of skills would continue to evolve and expand, helping to protect an increasingly connected world where corporate targets were becoming primary objectives for foreign intelligence, services, and terrorist organizations. The work would be challenging and dangerous, but it would also be meaningful in ways that her previous corporate career had never been. The woman who had once called herself a ghost was now fully visible, using every aspect of her experience and training to protect people who deserve to live and work without fear of sophisticated threats. Her legend had been reborn, not in shadows and secrecy, but in the clear light of acknowledged expertise and professional recognition. Sarah Chen had finally come home to herself, and the world was safer because she had stopped hiding from who she really was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.